Welcome to episode 79 of OTD, your daily dose of soccer history by 17 Laws Guy. It is January 18, 1961, and in English football, this is a watershed day, because on this day, the Football League's maximum wage is abolished, the hard ceiling that had kept players' earnings artificially low for generations. The cap is £20 a week in season and 17 in the summer, and it dies here, not in a boardroom, but in a moment of labor leverage with the Professional Footballers Association ready to go on strike. So today, we'll do three things. We'll go back to the start, professionalism, wages, and why football's rulers decided to cap pay in the first place. We'll trace how players organized, from charity and welfare fairs to the birth of a union that would eventually become the PFA. And we'll walk through the final years of the fight, 1956 to 61, when a still active Fulham player named Jimmy Hill drags the league into the modern world. Our story begins in 1885. That's the year professionalism is legalized in English football, and from that moment, wages become both inevitable and politically explosive. At first, pay is messy. Clubs compete for talent. Directors grumble about poaching. Players move, sometimes for reasons that look suspiciously like money. Then the Football League looks at the emerging labor market and reaches for the simplest stabilizer available: control. In 1901, the league introduces a maximum wage, £4 a week in season, and the logic is clear. Stop richer clubs from hoarding talent and stop wages from spiraling in a young industry with fragile finances. And here's the key. The wage cap doesn't sit alone. It sits alongside the retain and transfer system, the contract machinery that keeps players tied to clubs even after their deals end. So the player isn't just limited in what he can earn for his talent. He's also not free. That combination is what the players themselves will later call a form of feudalism. Now add the human cost, because the early professional era is also physically brutal. On August 17, 1902, a Manchester City defender named Di Jones cuts his knee in a pre-season practice match. The wound becomes infected. 10 days later, he has shockingly and tragically succumbed to blood poisoning and lockjaw. This is one of those stories that sounds medieval until you remember the timeline. Tetanus vaccination doesn't arrive in the UK until decades later. Di Jones's death is not the only one. Football in that era is full of stories of infection, amputation, and yes, players dying from what begins as just a cut. And that matters for labor history because it reframes what a footballer is. Not a celebrity, not a global asset. He's a worker with no real security. So the push to organize isn't only about wages. It's about welfare, dignity, and basic rights. By 1907, players form a new union, the Association Football Players and Trainers Union, convened at Manchester's Imperial Hotel, with leading players involved, including figures from the Manchester game, like Billy Meredith, whom we also talked about in yesterday's episode. The Players' Union's targets are explicit: the maximum wage and the retain and transfer restrictions. And that's the story in one line. For more than half a century, the players keep trying to break two locks at once: the pay ceiling and the contract cage. Now fast forward to the 1950s, because this is where the wage cap starts looking not merely unfair, but absurd. Post-war Britain is recovering. Floodlights spread. Crowds swell. And European football becomes a new theatre. Wolves play under lights against Honved, and England argues with itself about what the real elite level looks like. The European Cup arrives, and continental clubs start operating like big modern institutions. And English players look outward and see a brutal comparison. The best players abroad can earn far more than the best players at home, not because English football is poor, but because English football has capped its own labor market. The cap has become a self-inflicted limitation. This is the exact moment Jimmy Hill walks into the story. He is not a retired activist looking for a cause. No, he's a serving professional, a Fulham player, collecting union subs, watching how the system works, and deciding to get involved to fix it from the inside. In 1956, he is elected secretary of the Players' Union and modernizes it, including the famous rebranding into the Professional Footballers Association, the PFA, very typical Jimmy Hill, which we'll get back to. In 1957, he becomes chairman with a campaign promise that sounds impossible: abolish the maximum wage. And Hill's genius is that he understands the battle isn't only moral, it's tactical. He uses the media, he uses public pressure. He makes the league look old-fashioned, paternal, and unjust, because by the late 1950s, Britain itself is changing. So by 1960, the PFA is no longer merely arguing, it's organizing. Players vote for strike action starting Saturday, January 21st, 1961. Meetings are held across the country. The threat becomes credible enough that the government gets nervous, because a football strike doesn't just remove sport, it removes pools, coupons, and Saturday routine. Hill calls it what it is, labor, and the league, forced into a corner, tries compromise and delay. But January 18, 1961 arrives as the decisive day. Hill goes to the Ministry of Labour. A settlement is reached, and on the steps, in time for the evening news, he announces the strike is called off because the maximum wage is gone. And within hours, the symbolic moment lands. Fulham's chairman is the entertainer, Tommy Trinder, who had publicly promised that if the cap ever fell, he'd pay his best player what he was worth, £100 a week. The cap falls, and Trinder has to pay. So Johnny Haynes becomes the first £100 a week footballer in England, not because Haynes, the maestro, is the only star, but because the wall has cracked and someone must be first. What about Jimmy Hill himself? Well, he doesn't cash in. He's still a player, and by his own recollection, he's still on modest money, still dealing with a knee that will end his playing days. And here's the crucial point. The abolition is not the end of the story, because the cap is only one lock. The PFA immediately keeps pushing for freedom of contract, for genuine mobility, which is why the fight rolls forward into the next landmark, the retain and transfer system. In 1963, with PFA backing, George Eastham wins his case in the High Court, and the retain and transfer system is ruled an unreasonable restraint of trade. So the early 1960s become the two-step liberation, first wages, then movement. Now zoom out, because once the wage ceiling breaks, football never looks back again. At first, the change is symbolic more than extravagant. £100 a week is headline money, but it is still a world away from the modern game. Then money grows, slowly, then faster. Television expands, commercial sponsorship becomes normal, and player pay begins to reflect the real economics of a national obsession. That has consequences. It helps clubs keep stars longer. It professionalizes careers. It raises standards. But it also widens divides. Some clubs surge, others fall behind. Celebrity culture arrives and the tabloids discover footballers as constant content. The George Best era is unimaginable without the wage era that begins here. Then the darker 1970s and 80s come. Economic crisis, decaying grounds, falling attendances, violence, hooliganism, and disasters. Bradford, Heysel, and Hillsborough. And then the Taylor Report era of rebuilt stadiums and rebuilt business models. And then, in 1992, the Premier League is born, football's full commercial breakaway, powered by broadcasting money. Well, that's a different OTD episode in its own right. But the point today is a straight line. The Premier League's wage universe doesn't begin in 1992. It begins on January 18, 1961, when English football stops pretending it can hold back the market forever. And one last connection for regular listeners. Later in 1961, after retirement from Fulham, Jimmy Hill steps into management at Coventry. The story we told in episode 29, when the maximum wage revolutionary becomes football's first true modernizer of the matchday experience with his own visionary revolution, colored in sky blue. If you haven't listened to that episode, please do. It's fascinating. Jimmy Hill was far ahead of his time. But back to January 18, 1961. What should we take away from that day? Well, you know it. 3 points. First, this wasn't just a pay rise. It was labor history. The maximum wage fell because players organized, threatened collective action, and forced institutions to recognize them as workers with rights. Second, the wage cap wasn't only about greed or morality. It was a governance tool designed to protect clubs and competitive balance, but over time it became a ceiling on the sport's own development and an embarrassment in a Europeanizing game. And third, once you remove a ceiling, you don't control where the room expands. Abolishing the cap helped professionalize football further and also set the sport on the road to today's financial extremes, where the richest clubs can buy almost anyone, but still can't buy guaranteed success, which we'll surely talk about in future episodes. On this day in 1961, football's wage era began, and the modern game, the one built on bargaining power, broadcasting, celebrity, and money that travels, took a decisive step into being. That's all for episode 79 of OTD, the £20 ceiling breaks, Jimmy Hill and the day football's wage era began. If you have family stories about what players earned in the 1950s, memories of the union fight, or a favorite example of football money working or failing, email me at otd@17lawsguy.com. Some ideas have started trickling in. Please keep it coming. And please rate the show 5 stars, subscribe, and tell a friend. Tomorrow, in episode 80, we go to 2010 and the story around Olympiacos sacking their Brazilian icon manager, Zico. See you then.